You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Well, we're back. You know that unpleasant smell when you put your foot in dog shit? Well, hopefully not your foot, your shoe in dog shit, and it kind of lingers around for ages. Well, we're back. Now, just in case you're interested in doing something, apart from being a keyboard warrior, there's a few things happening with public interest before corporate interest and Anarchist Media Institute. Tonight, that's the 14th of August, having our monthly get-together at the Alicia Restaurant at the corner of Hope Street. That's right, Hope Street. The love child of desire and expectation, the desire for change and the expectation that it will occur. Hope Street and Sydney Road, Brunswick, starting at around 6 p.m. You'll see a table there somewhere, and come and join us. Look, it's not some deep political, philosophical discussion. It's not like the Salvation Army. You've got to listen to the sermon before you get fed. It's very simple. It's about getting people with similar ideas, not the same, but similar ideas together in a social setting. Life can be very isolated for a lot of people, especially with these types of ideas that we promote here on the Anarchist World this week. So it's a great way to get together and meet like-minded people from across the state, believe it or not. So tonight, that's the 14th, 6 p.m. at Alicia Restaurant at the corner of Hope Street and Sydney Road in Brunswick. We only ask for one thing, and that is you bring cash, C-A-S-H, because there are no split bills. So bring some cash to pay for your own food and drinks. That's right, we're not a charity. You come in for your own food and drinks. Now, the following Wednesday, that's the 21st, at the Footscray Hotel, 48 Hopkins Street in Footscray. It is not the mega metropolis on the corner. It is just further down the road. It's the place where the carpets are so threadbare they can't even be beer soaked. So 6:30 p.m, that's next Wednesday, the 21st, at the Footscray Hotel for a 7 o'clock start. And I'll be doing a presentation on, believe it or not, Upper Canadian and Lower Canadian revolutionaries who were sent to Australia as convicts in the early 1840s. It'll be a fascinating discussion, hopefully, because there's a lot of loose ends we need to bring together. And then on the last Wednesday of the month at La Porquetta's at the Superhighway in Frankston, we're having another gathering for like-minded people on the south side of this city, or south side of Victoria. Come along, 6:30 p.m. start at La Porquetta's and the Superhighway in Frankston. So that's lots of things. And if you find yourself in the city at a loose end because you haven't got any money to pay for all that stuff at the upper end of Collins Street, come and join us on the steps of the Victorian Parliament House, midday to 1 p.m, every Thursday on a public housing everybody's business vigil. So the sacred cows have come in. There's 3 of them. They don't have any garlands on today. I don't understand why, but the satellite is upon us. We're about to blast off. We will see you tonight.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World this week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio satellite. Today we've got 3 producers in the studio, and they're all about to file out in single file. Yes, the things I have to put up with here on the Anarchist World This Week. This is the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. And just in case you're throwing up your hands in horror and are wondering what the Anarchist World This Week is about, well, this is the 47th year I've been doing this program. My name is Joseph Toscano. It's a very simple concept, anarchos without rulers. Not without rules, but without rulers. What causes most of the dilemmas on the planet today? Inequalities in power and wealth. What is the anarchist struggle? The anarchist struggle is to devolve power, share power, possibly through direct democratic means, and the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Exceptionally conservative concepts. Obviously, the process to achieve an anarchist society is radical and revolutionary, but the concept themselves are exceptionally conservative. Could you think of anything more radical than sacrificing your life and the life of your children and grandchildren for some ruler, for some nation state, for some religious ideology? If you can't imagine that, well, keep listening to the Anarchist World This Week. But if that is your bag, I suggest you tune out, because you may be upset. All right, let's move on. Look, I'm excited. I am so excited. I'm excited because the federal government is trying to push emergency legislation through federal parliament. I'm thinking to myself, emergency legislation. We've finally seen some sense. The world is in equilibrium. We're going to push through emergency legislation in Parliament to provide housing for everybody who needs housing in this country. No, Joe. Oh, well, we're going to provide emergency legislation to ensure that all kids going to public schools get adequate resources so we don't have terrible NAPLAN results. No, Joe. Well, we're going to push emergency legislation through Parliament to ensure that the financial sector stops ripping us off. No, Joe. Oh, I'm a bit confused. Oh, now I know what it's all about. It's about all those bullies in the construction division of the CFMEU. Now, I've seen a lot of things happen over the last 50 years, and I'm sure, 60 years since I've been an activist, since I was, 15 or 16. That makes it 55 years. But it's incredible, the pile-on we're seeing regarding this CFMEU. Now, I am 100% positive the CFMEU has got a few corrupt elements in it, like every human organisation on the planet. And I'm sure there are people in the CFMEU that are putting bucks in their pockets. But the response to allegations, that's right, allegations that the CFMEU has been involved in or the construction division of the CFMEU has been involved in nefarious activities. We hear things like criminal elements, bikie gangs, all right? I never knew it was illegal to be a member of a bikie gang. I'll have to tell my brother-in-law, who's over 70, who still rides a bike. Well, that's a different story. But what a pile-on. Allegations here, allegations there. Now, when allegations and then royal commissions were held into the financial sector, into the aged care sector, into veteran suicides, And the list goes on and on. And all these negative findings, that's right, negative findings, came from these royal commissions which spent years forensically going through the evidence. Was there any call for emergency legislation to resolve the issues in the aged care sector? No. Was there any calls to ensure that the illegal practices carried out, that's right, illegal practices carried out by the financial sector were, people went to prison or even were charged? No. Never. Never. And whenever you've got some corporation which is involved in, let's say, some nefarious activities, do we have emergency legislation to put them in administration, or do we allow those organisations to use, that's right, to use the rights they enjoy under law to defend themselves, defend their organisations, defend their companies from the allegations which have been raised? No. We just say, yeah, look, there's all these terrible things happening around us. Let's not worry about it. Leave it up to the courts. Never gets to the courts. No emergency legislation. But when it comes to one of the most successful trade unions in this country, and let's not forget that less than 12% of Australians are now in trade unions, when there are allegations around bullying tactics, and these bullying tactics are nothing more than normal push and shove you see in any industrial dispute, it's the end of the known universe. And we need emergency legislation to remove their legal rights to defend themselves and push legislation through Parliament in order to put them into administration. Extraordinary. Extraordinary. Aren't there better things we could be looking at in terms of emergency legislation? Maybe emergency legislation in terms of nationalising this country's extraordinary mineral resources so we don't have to go cap in hand to governments to ensure people have access to the basic necessities in this country? Of course not. But when it comes to a trade union, wow, let's get that emergency legislation through Parliament. Extraordinary. What an extraordinary state of affairs we find ourselves in this country. I am making no apologies for the construction division of the CFMEU. I don't know what's going on. I've been told by the corporate-owned media and the government-gelded ABC and every Tom, Dick and Harry and Maud and Sybil that they're involved in bullying tactics, and there may be some corruption in certain elements in the CFMEU, and I'm quite happy for things to play out under the current legislative framework we have. And let's not forget, when people say, let's bring back the building whatever commission to keep these thugs, in inverted commas, under control, let's not forget we had 10 years of that shit and nothing happened. Let's not forget there was a royal commission into the CFMEU, the construction division, about a decade ago, and there was not much dirty linen to be aired. And let's not forget that the legislation that was just passed in the past gave members of the CFMEU less legal rights than a drug dealer who'd imported $1 billion worth of meth into this country because they didn't even have the right to silence. If they didn't answer questions that were asked, they were charged and penalised. So let's get this story right. I mean, to me, maybe we need emergency legislation to ensure there is food security in this country for an increasing number of people. I don't see that emergency legislation. I don't see emergency legislation going through Parliament, to set up distribution centres which are publicly funded by the government of the day at the state and federal level. All I see is charities being pushed into a corner to provide services, essential services like food, to an increasing number of Australians. And the tragedy is that many of these people are still working. I didn't see any emergency legislation go through Parliament when we saw the robo-debt fiasco, a totally illegal program conducted by the previous reactionary Liberal National Party, when everybody knew it was bloody illegal, including the public servants who actually implemented it. I didn't see any emergency legislation to see the likes of Morrison spend a few days in a cell somewhere because of the damage they did to so many tens of thousands of Australians, and the continuing anxiety suffered by people who are, exposed to that. There was no emergency legislation. But when some person in the corporate-owned media has an investigation and says, there's allegations of corruption, possible corruption, allegations of thuggery, allegations of bikie gangs being involved in the CFMEU, the construction division of the CFMEU, it's the end of the known universe. What an extraordinary country we live in. But what's much more extraordinary is the way so many people swallow the shit that's forced down our necks on virtual platforms and the legacy media day after day after day after day. Let's have some emergency legislation regarding some issues which affect millions of people in this country. You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano, and if you've got any complaints, that's your problem. Let's move on. Aren't you excited? All those bills that come in for all these virtual things we have. I want to look at virtual platforms and artificial intelligence today, and I want to look at it in a different way to most people look at it, because I think it's important that we understand where we are today and what's happening. Because, see, when the internet was first created, it was created to liberate us from the domination of a legacy media which is owned by corporate interests or owned by the state. It was supposed to be a decentralised system which would empower you and me. Not empower you and me to look up shit, but empower you and me to do things outside the structures that had been confining us for so long. For example, I'll give you an example. Now, in the bad old days when in this country anyway, the Murdoch media set the political, social and cultural agenda, it hasn't changed much, but it had even more power then. The Whitlam-led Labor government did a very terrible thing. They did a lot of horrible things, that government. It was terrible things, no-fault divorce, radiation, all these horrible things, they did free education, civil celebrants. But the worst thing they did was actually not introduced Medicare or community health centres or community legal centres, none of that. No. The really horrible thing they did is they created the Community Radio Network, the Community Radio World, by issuing licences to community groups to set up radio stations like the one I'm broadcasting from, Community Radio 3CR, and hundreds more across this country, to bypass the legacy media. Then comes the virtual world. And we're all excited in the early 1990s regarding the virtual world and the liberty it is going to give us as individual and communities. But what happens? What happens? What we've seen is a centralisation of power in these virtual networks, which are owned by individuals and corporations. So we're seeing 8 billion people now being held hostage by virtual platforms whose major responsibilities to their major shareholders, they don't give a shit about the dislocation and the problems they cause in society, because it's a little bit like gambling ads. You need people's eyeballs on your virtual platform to make a buck. And the more devoid of humanity the content, the more eyeballs on that particular material. But the thing is, they've now become so powerful and so entwined in everyday reality that we have now lost, that's right, we have now lost the ability to actually be able to live a life free of the domination of these highly centralised systems which have become an integral part of everyday life for almost every human being on this planet. Whether you're using a smartphone in the Sahara Desert as a Bedouin, or whether you're sitting in your office in Collins Street on the 80th floor, watching the view, it's the same story. And when a virtual platform hiccups, it has consequences for tens, if not hundreds of millions of people. So the problem isn't the virtual platform. The problem isn't the fact that we created an internet. The problem isn't artificial intelligence, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The problem is that we have allowed these important structures to be privately owned or to be state-owned and to be used to manipulate us into supporting them, supporting their aims to maximise their profits and their power. So if you're pissed off, you do have options. You do have options. Obviously, there are alternative platforms, but there are options. Do you really need to use these platforms? They need you. You don't need them. Think about it. Let's move on to artificial intelligence. Now, everybody's upset about artificial intelligence. Now, I may have spoken about this before, but I'll go through it again, because I think we're at the verge of another revolution, the digital revolution. And artificial intelligence is what you and I have been waiting for. But the problem is, are we going to allow a small cabal to control artificial intelligence? Or are we going to ensure that it is controlled by the community, like community radio? Are we going to let it go? I'll give you an example. Now, artificial intelligence is nothing new. Over 2,000 years ago, in the good old days of the Roman Republic, before it became an empire, you had patricians and plebeians, right? And they both had political power. Although the patricians had economic power, the plebeians still had political power. And what happened as the Roman Empire expanded, we saw a whole influx of slaves. And slaves were manna from heaven to the ruling class, the patricians. And they used these slaves to create huge estates to maximise returns for them. At the same time, the plebeians, who were an essential, integral part of the Roman Republic, were no longer relevant. Their labour was no longer needed. So there was a dilemma, similar to the dilemma of artificial intelligence. There was this dilemma. More and more people were being excluded from the economic framework of the Roman Empire. So what did the Roman patrician classes do? Well, they did what we don't do. They introduced the bread and circus. Sorry for the tautology. Subsidised housing, subsidised food for the plebeians. You don't want them to revolt because it can turn the apple cart. And at the same time, provide them with entertainment. Over 200 days of public holidays and festivals. Keep them occupied. Keep them fed. Keep them housed. Well, let's get to 2024. Look at the situation. Artificial intelligence. We're on a curve. Unfortunately, we're allowing artificial intelligence not to be controlled by the community, but we're allowing artificial intelligence to be controlled and financed by a small section, a minuscule section of society. Because artificial intelligence is going to create the same problems that slavery created in the Roman Empire, as the Roman Empire expanded. People like you and me, there will be no role for us. No role in the productive forces in a capitalist society where wage slavery is the norm. Because there's no role for you and me, what are they going to do with us? What are they going to do with us? Well, why not a universal basic income? We don't need everybody in the society to be involved in the productive process with artificial intelligence, but what we do need is a system where every individual in the society has the capacity to develop themselves to their fullest extent through the provision of basic resources to individuals and communities. We are not just automatons. We are not just, cyborgs. We're human beings. And a universal basic income is a mechanism via which we can all profit from artificial intelligence by having non-sentient beings do the work which we are chained to today in order to get enough pennies, or should say cents, to survive. So let's look at it. We are at the beginning of real change, and what direction that change goes is dependent on what we demand, because we are not passive consumers. Now, I keep using the words, and I haven't used them on this program, carping, cringing, complaining, consumers, because that's what we've been reduced to in the 21st century. We're not citizens with rights and responsibilities, apart from the responsibility to cast a ballot every 3 to 4 years, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But, we are nothing more than wage slaves. And if you're on social security benefits, it's a handout mentality. It's not about allowing people to develop themselves to their fullest potential. It's about creating a society where each and every one of us had that ability. And this is one country on planet Earth. I don't know if it exists anywhere else in the universe, because I'm not familiar with what happens in the universe. But there's one sovereign nation state on planet Earth with a miserable 26 million people out of 8 billion who is in the pilot seat in terms of having the resources with the introduction of artificial intelligence to ensure that each and every one of us lives a safe, secure, productive life, whether we are or we are not part of the wage system. So think about it. So next time somebody talks about artificial intelligence, you talk about a universal basic income. You listen to, we don't want to find ourselves in a Blade Runner situation, and we will if we don't, at the very beginning, fight for what we want and need. You listen to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name is Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting today's program. You can leave messages, pleasant ones, please, because I delete unpleasant ones. 0439 395 489. Yes, you can write to me to Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. If you're interested in public interest before corporate interests, you can join online, pibci.net. Currently, we're in the process of going through our membership, and obviously we'll be getting rid of the dead wood because we're interested in people being active in the organisation. So if you are interested in public interest before corporate interests and you want to see before you buy, encourage you, if you're in Melbourne on the 1st September, Wattle Day, that's right. I'm sure you've all noticed the wattle. Well, not if you're living in the city, but if you live outside the city, you'll be noticing the wattle, which is blooming everywhere. Well, the 1st September is Wattle Day, which I think should be our national holiday. I don't think anybody's against wattle. You never know. But 1st September, 1 p.m, if you're in Melbourne, Parliamentary Gardens. Where else would public interest before corporate interests meet? Parliamentary Gardens. Picnic. Bring your own food and drinks. We're going to unfurl, you like that? Gunna. We're going to unfurl 2 new banners on the day and rebadge the organisation. So you're all welcome, members or not, to come along. Melbourne, Parliamentary Gardens, which is the corner of Spring Street and Latrobe Street. It's that garden with the fountain you can walk under. You can do that all afternoon if you wish. Come along, bring a rug, bring some food, bring some drinks, bring yourself. Great chance to meet members of public interest before corporate interests. Because ultimately, I can carry on for the next, 3 or 4 years the way things are going. Or, but it doesn't really matter what I say. What matters is what you do, how you think about yourself, your role in the community, and how you can actually change society. Because if you look at every important historical moment which has improved the life of the many, it's been through radical rebellion. You're not given things because you plead and you get on your knees. You're given things because you shake the table to make sure some apples fall off in your direction. So please join public interest before corporate interest if you want some apples falling in your direction. Also, don't forget YouTube channel, Public Interest Before Corporate Interest. I've got about 300, almost 300 presentations up. Have a look at it, see what you think. It's a good way to look at society in a different way because, we're not all the same, are we? All right, you're listening to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast on the Community Radio Network across Australia, north to south, east to west. My name's Joseph Toscano. Identity politics. Now, I know this is going to be very unpopular, but that's the way life is on The Anarchist World this week. I don't care if we're unpopular. Identity politics, the superhighway to irrelevance. Now, I know identity politics is important for individuals and for sections of society that for far too long have been oppressed. But it's just a little tiny step in a struggle. Because it doesn't matter the colour, the sexual preference, the cultural background, the religious, persuasion of the person who has their boot on your neck that counts. What counts is the fact that there is a boot on your neck. And for far too long in this country, we have allowed that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication through the legacy media and through virtual platforms to divide us on the basis of race, culture, language, colour of our skin, sexual preference, you name it, they'll divide us. But the thing about capitalism, it can incorporate every identity, politics, campaign. Did the world fall apart in this country when marriage equality became part and parcel of this country's legislation? No. Did the world fall apart when homosexual activity was decriminalised? No. Did the world fall apart when, we looked at, cultural... No, it doesn't fall apart. It can be easily incorporated into the capitalist system, which is a system based on a private investment for private profit mentality. Easily incorporated. But can they incorporate a struggle to share wealth, to break down hierarchy? Can capitalism incorporate that struggle? No. It can't. And ultimately, if you don't want to wake up every morning to another story about somebody going hungry in this country or somebody who can't get, a service in this country, well, then maybe we should actually be looking at the economic structures that we have in this country, which reward criminals. That's right. Reward people who are willing to break the rules. Reward people who are willing to exploit the community at large. But penalise, that's right, penalise people like you and me, losers. I like to think of myself as a loser. Pay my taxes, obey the law, do the right things by people, or try. Obviously, I don't do it all the right thing by people all the time, but you try. But see, we're considered to be losers because we're not rich and powerful. It's only the celebrity, the rich and powerful that are the winners in this society. What an extraordinary world we live in. All right, look, I'm not going to pontificate anymore. I'll leave that to the Pope. Let's move on. Lost opportunity. Now, I know there's been a little bit of bother lately in certain sections of the media regarding the failure to have a Makarrata and the failure to have a treaty and the failure for this and that. Look, boys and girls, those of you who are regular listeners to the Anarchist World this week know that I was a great supporter of the referendum regarding a voice, not because I believed a voice would actually radically or even mildly change Indigenous people, First Nations people's situation. But I did believe that if a government was faced with the fact that a majority of Australian people were willing to grant this small reform to First Nations people, then we would have the momentum for truth-telling and a federal treaty, a real treaty, not a state-based treaty, but a real treaty. Obviously, that momentum is lost. It has been lost. Because no government is going to embark down that path, as we've seen, without majority support from the Australian people. So it was a lost opportunity. Lost opportunity. It's one of the things I'll go to my grave, being seen as a lost opportunity. As I saw in 1999, the struggle to make this country a republic, lost opportunity when that referendum was lost. And I'll tell you why. A treaty is an agreement between the government of the day and a group of people, in this case the First Nations people. That's what a treaty is. A referendum, this is the subtlety that people didn't understand. A referendum is when the people, that's right, the people give the government of the day the green light to proceed with a legislative agenda which will make significant differences to people's lives. Now, I could be, I'm not, I'll say I'm not, but I could be the greatest philanthropist in human history, right? I could take the shirt off my back, not that it's a pretty sight, but I would take and give it to somebody. I could take my boots off and give them to someone. I could even take off my underpants, which would be thrown away. But, I could give away everything I own. It isn't very much. You can have my, 19 whatever, car, but I may make a difference for a day, a week, a month to one individual in society, one individual or two or a family. And I may feel very good about it. And why shouldn't I feel very good about it? Because I'm cold now. Nobody will give me a coat because I've given the shirt off my back. But the reality is, it's a little bit like the old adage. Give a man, give a woman, give a family some fish to eat. And in 12 hours or 24 hours later, they'll still be hungry. Teach them how to fish. You resolve the problem. As long as there are fish in the sea, and that's another debate we need to have. It's the same, what's the point? What is the point of being a philanthropist or doing charity work when the impact you have is minimal? Look at all these. There's 32,000 registered charities in this country. There shouldn't be one. There shouldn't be one person going hungry or not having a bed to sleep in tonight if they want a bed to sleep in. There shouldn't be in this country, especially this country. But there is. There is. So we are faced with every day with all these lost opportunities because we're too busy fighting each other because of peripheral differences. Think about it. That's what the Anarchist World this week. That's what this program is about. It's about getting you to think about things. Because ultimately, as I said before, it's people coming together which change things. It's not people fighting each other, but it's about people coming together. So if you see people try to split people on the basis of race, identity, culture, language, you name it, tell them to piss off. Because all they are doing is reinforcing the power of that 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, which set the parliamentary agenda every single day. Gaza. The carnage continues. Now remember, on this program, we don't use the word war. I mean, Gaza is about half the size of Sydney or Melbourne. I think it's even smaller. Population of over 2 million people. I think over 80% of the place has been flattened. Over 40,000 people have been killed, mostly children, old people, women. What's the point of trying to kill healthy young men with guns? A bit hard, but it's easy to bomb. But that's a different story. So it's carnage. It's not a war. One side's got tanks, the other side hasn't got tanks. One side has got the United States supporting it. The other side hasn't really got anybody supporting it. There's a ragtag army. One side has missiles, the other side hasn't got missiles. One side has planes, the other side hasn't planes. I mean, it's what's called carnage. It's not a war. It is carnage. And we sit on the sideline week after week. Remember that little journey almost a year ago we began when we started walking past every man, woman and child that had been killed in Gaza? We got to 20 kilometres, then 25 kilometres, then 30 kilometres. That's every metre, a dead person. Now we've got to 40 kilometres. Well, you do a 40-kilometre walk. And as you're walking, think about there's a man, woman, child, mainly women and children, lined up, dead for 40 kilometres. Think about it. That's Gaza. That's the carnage. And the fact is we can't even, the world can't even force the Israeli government and the Israeli Defence Forces to come to some type of agreement regarding a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. This doesn't negate what happened on the 7th of October when 1,200 Israelis were slaughtered and hostages were taken. It doesn't negate that atrocity. But we've come to the situation where this carnage is no longer acceptable. But we sit on the sidelines. Well, when it comes to the carnage in Ukraine, happy, very happy, to give billions of dollars in armaments to the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people to defend themselves against Russian aggression, but not happy to even give a cent. We've got the ridiculous situation of our beloved opposition leader, the Prime Minister in waiting, the god of fear, Mr. Dutton, saying that we shouldn't be taking Palestinian refugees into this country because they are a threat to this country's security, and that everyone should be subject to an ASIO investigation, all those that have arrived. Well, let's see how far they go interviewing a 3-month-old child, whether they get any sense of them. Maybe if they use some prods or, beat them on the butt, they get an answer. What a ridiculous situation we find ourselves in 2024 in this country. What a ridiculous situation. Calling slaughter war. Well, lost for words, which is highly unusual on the anarchist world this week. Parliamentary democracy. See, democracy is an interesting concept. It's based on the concept of the greatest good for the greatest number. It's not about majority rules. That's why we have constitutions, to protect minorities from the majority. Because, say 56% of Australians believe that 2-year-old blue-eyed children are the spawn of the devil and should be slaughtered publicly in a big bonfire. Does that make it ethical? Moral? Of course not. Majorities believe anything, It's not about majority rule. It's about the greatest good for the greatest number. It's rule of the people, by the people, for the people. That's the traditional definition of democracy, okay? Rule of the people, by the people, for the people. It's called direct democracy. Now, we have representative democracy, and that's an interesting concept. It's an old-fashioned concept, which we've had for almost 200 years. You and I, after being, regaled by who knows whom, have the opportunity in the Western democracies, a little bit better than the Chinese, to cast a ballot for us to represent our interests in Parliament, whether it's a federal parliament, state parliament, local government. We've got that beautiful duty. It's not a right in this country, it's a duty, okay? We've been through that in the past, okay? So we cast our ballot and I get on the soapbox and I've got $1 billion behind me and I've got advertising everywhere and I've got all these celebrities saying, vote one Joseph Toscano, he's a great human being, all right, okay? I get into Parliament on a platform of, say, universal basic income. Then I get into Parliament and, and I become Prime Minister. The party, gets elected. I'm Prime Minister. And I say, well, boys and girls, I lied to you. I just wanted to get into Parliament. I just wanted to live in the lodge. I just wanted to have a good time. Obviously, it's not that extreme. But I'm not going to do it. What are you going to do about it? The fact is, apart from revolution, blood in the streets, all you can do is wait for the next election and go through the whole farce again, because that's what parliamentary democracy is all about. And when political parties, which are bankrolled by corporations and are supported by a legacy and virtual media, which, wants to continue the private investment for private profit mantra, well, obviously, obviously, if you can't do anything about it in between elections, they do what they like. And we see it all the time. We see people being elected for one party, then, leaving that party and becoming independent or joining another party or saying, well, it's not the right time for this policy. And the list goes on and on. So it's really a failed, flawed concept, parliamentary democracy. It's all we got, but it is a failed, flawed concept. And it's very important in this country because we don't have the constitutional protections which many other Western democracies have in terms of the individual being protected from the arbitrary exercise of not just state power, but the tyranny of a majority which has been whipped up in a frenzy to believe that the other in their society is the problem. I mean, that was the root of fascism. That was the root of Nazism. That was the root of Pol Pot's murderous regime. It's always the other that's the problem if you get rid of the other. And that's why you need a constitution, and this is what I've spoken about ad nauseum over the last 47 years, that protects the rights of the individual against the arbitrary exercise of state power and the exercise of the power of a majority. And we don't have that in this country. There was a debate in the 1890s to introduce some constitutional arrangements which would protect the individual, but we said no. Our founding papas said no. We don't want this. The minority was overruled. We don't want people to have rights. We don't want the Australian people to institute legislative change through citizens-initiated referendums. We don't want electors to have the power to recall non-performing or lying politicians, recall them and have a fresh election in between elections. We don't want our parliamentary system to be free and fair. We want it to be dominated by the powerful and the rich in our country. So, you're always faced with this dilemma when you get elected to Parliament. You find that ultimately real power, even in a parliamentary democracy, does not lie in Parliament. They have real power to make your life and my life a misery. All right? No question about that. When the state comes down on you, as we've seen with the CFMEU, you're mincemeat, okay? Very hard to resist. But do we ever see the state come down on the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication? No. And you know why? Because in a parliamentary system, what they say has profound implications for the ability of our parliamentary representatives to be re-elected. So it's not about the rich and powerful saying to parliamentarians, you've got to do this or you've got to do that. It's about parliamentarians understanding that if they attempt to pass legislation which redistributes wealth or changes the way we interact economically or stops, socialising the losses and asks the private sector to, clean up their own mess, well, then their chances of being re-elected are nil because of the concentration of power and wealth they have, which they're willing to use to ensure they continue to dominate activity in this country. That's why we have corporations making astounding profits and individuals having a crisis in terms of, the economy. That's why we have, as I said last week, a younger population which is desperate. And those of you who, have access to younger people understand how difficult life has become for younger people in this country because of our belief that the only way forward, and the key is the only way forward, is through a private investment for private profit mantra. I mean, people throw their up hands in horror in this country when you say, well, maybe there's another way. Maybe we should use superannuation funds to bankroll cooperatives and collectives to set up a third arm of the economy. Maybe we should renationalise essential services in this country. Horror of horror. The devil is upon us. I mean, that's the reaction these days. Maybe we should have public housing. You're kidding. Really? We're going to remove the private sector from it? No, we'll give them more public land to produce private housing, a little bit of social housing. I mean, the last ridiculous thing I've noticed is, remember the ridiculous situation where not only do we pay for the aged care sector and the individuals involved pay for it, we now bankroll the wage increase for the workers, and now that's happening in the early childhood development sector. They get a pay rise, but is it paid for by the early childhood monopolies which control this particular facet of human need? No, of course not. Of course not. We'll get the taxpayer to pay the increase in the wages for these poorly paid workers. What an extraordinary world we live in. It's the old story. We live in a society where we privatise the profits and socialise the losses. For example, gambling industry, lots of pain. It's not just about a debate about advertising. It should be a debate about them paying for the damage they cause in the community. Alcohol, same thing. Look at it. There are many privately owned organisations which do horrific damage in the community, and we, through the public health sector, we, the people, pay for their extraordinary profits. What a world we live in. Now, if Rip Van Winkle woke up, I am sure he would be disgusted by the situation he found himself in. He woke up, he would have been disgusted. Look, thank you for listening to The Anarchist World this week. But the important thing is, it's not about listening, it's about doing. Now, we do a few little things, not much. You can go to my Facebook page, Joseph Toscano. You can go to the Anarchist Media Institute. You can go to the Public Interest Before Corporate Interest. You can go to josephtoscano.nam. You can write, you can do this, you can do that. But ultimately, it's not about listening, it's about doing. It's not about just working with us. There are many organisations in this country which are trying to change things, trying to deal with the climate emergency, deal with inequality. It's not about philanthropy. It's about action. It's about changing policy. It's about changing the way people think in this country. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast, so don't despair. It could be a little bit late for the podcast the next week or two, but that's all right. It will be podcast, 3cr.org.au. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week, and lovely, nice messages, 0439 395 489, and don't forget our Wattle Day picnic on the 1st September. Do your own picnic anywhere in Australia. Celebrate Wattle Day. A great day. I don't think anybody's against wattle unless you've got allergies. All right. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station. Listen in next week to The Anarchist World this week.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to The Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.